Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a pretty significant development.
Yeah, this just announced trade deal between the U.S. and China.
Exactly. We're looking at it through the lens of a Fox News YouTube video. It was titled, Good News is Trump Makes Trade Deal with China.
Right.
So, our mission for you today is to kind of sift through the initial noise, understand the first few details, think about what it might mean, and, get the context around this announcement from the Trump administration.
Especially considering the lead-up with Treasury Secretary Bessent and Trade Representative Greer apparently working on this in Geneva.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we start?
Well, the core announcement, right. A trade deal has reportedly been reached.
Hmm.
And President Trump came out saying substantial progress was made. He also linked it, interestingly, to resolving a national emergency, though he didn't specify which one.
Right, that detail was missing, and he said more specifics would come out the next day.
That's the indication, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of anticipation for those details.
Okay, substantial progress. We also heard from Senator John Hooven, didn't we, from North Dakota?
We did. He sounded pretty positive, called it very encouraging.
And an important first step, I think.
Yeah, that's right. He did add the caveat that, it's maybe not a fully done deal yet, but a framework seems to be there.
Which lines up a bit with what you said about Bessent and Greer working on it in Geneva. So what about those initial reactions? Anything else stand out?
Well, it's maybe a subtle thing, but the language difference is interesting.
Hmm.
You have the president saying substantial progress, who am echoing that positivity.
Mm-hmm.
But then Secretary Bessent, speaking from Geneva, used the phrase great progress.
Okay.
He didn't quite go so far as to say, yes, we have a finalized deal.
So a bit more reserved.
Exactly. And, that often signals something in these high-level talks. Maybe the big pieces are in place, but the finer points are still being hammered out.
That makes sense. The source, the video, it also floated the idea this might look like the U.S.-UK deal.
Yeah, I'd mentioned that possibility. That one focused on lowering tariffs, aluminum, steel, cars, things like that.
So that gives us a potential model, maybe. But the video also stressed that big questions are still out there, especially around non-tariff barriers.
Right.
Maybe quickly, for anyone listening, what's an example of a non-tariff barrier?
Sure. So it's basically anything that makes trade harder that isn't a direct tax, like a tariff.
Yeah.
Think about really complicated regulations that are tough for foreign companies to meet.
Okay.
Or maybe specific product standards that favor domestic producers, or even quotas limiting how much of something can be imported.
Got it. So hurdles, but not taxes.
Exactly. And sometimes those can actually be bigger roadblocks than the tariffs themselves.
And the trade imbalance definitely came up. That huge gap where the U.S. buys, what, 3 times more from China than they buy from the U.S.?
Yeah, that figure was mentioned. It's clear a big U.S. goal is getting more access to China's market.
And then you have those other long-running issues.
Oh, yeah. Currency manipulation is often cited. Labor practices in China, how that
Yeah.
affects costs, and the huge one, intellectual property rights.
Right. So the report was clear. Lots of details still need to be ironed out, as they put it.
Absolutely. And this ties into something else the source hinted at, maybe a pattern in the negotiations.
Oh, what's that?
Well, you have President Trump announcing the positive news, sounding quite optimistic,
Right.
and then Secretary Bessent, the negotiator on the ground, offering a more, let's say, measured assessment.
Great progress, not quite deal done.
Exactly. And that could be, a deliberate tactic. Announce the goal, sound confident, but keep some caution publicly to maintain leverage for those final details.
Interesting. A bit of negotiation strategy playing out in public, perhaps.
It's possible. It happens in these kinds of talks.
Now, this is where it gets even more complex, looking at the wider context. This China deal isn't happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. The source explicitly connects it to other major diplomatic things going on.
Like the Iran nuclear negotiations.
Yeah, also happening in Geneva. Secretary Bessent involved there too, meeting with Iranian officials. And apparently both sides are reporting progress and planning more talks.
So how does China trade link to Iran nuclear talks?
Well, think about the global stage. China is a massive player in the Middle East. Critically, they buy a lot of Iranian oil.
Ah, okay.
So the U.S. relationship with China, especially on trade, could definitely have ripple effects on the discussions about Iran's nuclear program, The source even mentioned wanting to get China back on track on trade, suggesting maybe a broader strategy.
And then there's the hostage news. That's huge.
Yes, the announcement that Hamas is set to release Eden Alexander, the last known living American hostage in Gaza.
And the timing. It's
Yeah.
supposed to happen right as President Trump arrives in Saudi Arabia.
That's what the source indicated. The timing is definitely, well, noteworthy.
It's hard not to see connections, or at least a very busy diplomatic period.
Precisely. Drawing direct cause and effect is tough, without more info. But you have China trade progress, Iran nuclear talks moving, and a hostage release, all happening around the same time. It suggests a lot of moving parts.
And that point about the trade deficit came up again, too, the push to rebalance things with China.
Yeah, it underlines how economic goals and broader geopolitical influence often go hand in hand. Making progress on trade might create leverage elsewhere or vice versa.
It really shows how interconnected everything is.
It really does. These things aren't isolated silos.
And finally, the source also brought up Ukraine.
Right. Russia proposing direct peace talks with Ukraine, set to happen in Turkey.
And President Trump apparently urged Ukraine to go to these talks.
Yes. President Zelensky of Ukraine seemed initially open to meeting, but he stressed the need for a ceasefire first. That was a key condition for him.
Which adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. The source mentioned, briefly, things like internal challenges in Ukraine, Russia's influence with Turkey.
Yeah.
It's a really tough situation.
So it contrasts sharply, doesn't it? Potential progress with China on trade, the positive hostage news, but then the deep ongoing challenge in Ukraine.
It really does. It paints a picture of, well, simultaneous potential breakthroughs and very persistent, difficult conflicts.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up for today. We've got this U.S.-China trade deal announced. President Trump sounds optimistic. Senator Hoeven calls it a good first step.
But Secretary Bessent is a bit more measured, and we know big issues like non-tariff barriers and the trade imbalance are still on the table.
Right. And this is all happening while there are nuclear talks with Iran involving Secretary Bessent again, and the really welcome news about the American hostage Eden Alexander being released.
And looming over it all, in a sense, is the ongoing war in Ukraine, with these proposed peace talks facing immediate hurdles like the ceasefire demand.
It's quite a confluence of events, potential economic steps forward, a positive humanitarian development, but also the stark reality of a major conflict.
It really captures the complexity of the current global landscape, opportunities and challenges side by side.
So here's something to leave you with, a final thought to maybe chew on. We've talked about how interconnected all these things are: China, Iran, the Middle East, Ukraine. If this trade agreement with China does get finalized, how might that actually shift the dynamics in those other areas? Could it, for example, change how the U.S. engages with Iran or influence China's actions in the Middle East? What does all this diplomatic activity, this flurry of meetings and announcements, really tell us about where international relations might be heading?
That's the big question, isn't it? Lots to watch.
Definitely. We hope this deep dive gave you a clearer picture of these unfolding events.